Nobody asked the alien girl her name. I did, and the room never recovered. She was on the last cot in triage row 7 when I found her, and she had been there for 6 hours. I know because I pulled her intake slip. Stamped at the 14th bell. It was now the 20th. 6 hours on a cot with a documented fever of 39.4, a fluid deficit the intake scanner flagged in red, and not one staffer had touched her chart since processing. The slip had a single notation in Caliph script. I had enough of the language to read it. Labour caste, unsponsored, no lineage record. Below that, in the box reserved for clinical priority, someone had written the word that means, roughly, when resources allow. Resources had apparently not allowed. For 6 hours. I was 20 minutes past the end of my shift. I had a hot meal going cold in the staff room and a bunk I hadn't slept in for 30 hours. I looked at the cot. I looked at the slip. I picked up a fluid kit from the supply rack and walked to row 7. She was sitting up when I got there, which surprised me. Most patients with those numbers were flat. She was thin, pale grey skin, the kind that reads almost silver under fluorescent panels, copper amber hair pulled back with a cord, dark eyes that caught the light and held it the way still water does. She was watching the room. Not anxiously. Just watching, the way a person watches when they've learned that the watching is all they're going to get. I pulled the stool from under the cot and sat down. She looked at me. Not at the kit. At me. My name is Davin, I said in standard. I'm a medic. I'm sorry it took this long. I set the kit on the cot beside her. Can I ask your name? The pause before she answered was not the pause of someone who didn't understand. It was the pause of someone who hadn't been asked in a while. Setha, she said. Setha. I nodded. I'm going to get some fluid into you and run a full scan. Your intake flag shows a fever. Are you in pain anywhere? Another pause. Then, my side. Left. I worked. She let me, which told me something. She was exhausted enough to stop performing the self-sufficiency that people in her documented category wore like armor in processing stations. I found the fever, confirmed the fluid deficit, started a line. She watched my hands with those dark reflective eyes, but she didn't flinch. I asked her small questions while I worked. Was she cold? Was the light too bright? Had she eaten? She answered in short sentences. Not unfriendly. Careful. The portable scanner I'd grabbed was one of the older medical units, the kind that runs a full tissue and lineage baseline alongside the clinical panel because the clinical panel alone wasn't reliable on non-Caliph physiologies. I'd used it 100 times. I clipped the emitter to her wrist, started the cycle, and went back to checking her fluid line. That was when the scanner did something I had never seen it do. It stopped. Not powered down. It stopped mid-cycle and held, the progress bar frozen at 62%, and a small amber light came on that I did not recognize. I checked the unit. The amber light was labeled in Caliph script too small for me to read without my magnifier. I tapped the screen. Nothing moved. The unit was running. I could feel the faint vibration of active processing. It simply wasn't finishing. HM, I said. Setha looked at the scanner. Then at me. Her expression didn't change. Is something wrong with it? She asked. Don't know yet. I set the unit on the cot beside her and pulled out my field slate to look up the amber indicator code. It's still running. Probably a lineage baseline flag. The older units get fussy when the genome database hasn't been updated. You're not Caliph, so it might just be taking longer to cross-reference. I found the code in the manual index. Read it. Read it again. Just a processing flag, I said, because that was all she needed to know right then, and because I wasn't entirely sure what I was reading. It'll finish. She nodded once and looked away. I kept talking to her. It was what I did when patients were tense and I needed them calm. Not chatter, just presence. I asked whether she'd come in on the reach shuttle or the outer ring connector. She said the connector. I said the connector docking berths were brutal, all hard bench seating, no padding. She said she hadn't noticed. I believe her. She had the look of someone who had been uncomfortable long enough that she'd stopped filing it. Across the annex, I became aware that we had an audience. The station's administrative staff, 3 Caliph processors and one of the large grey Veth supervisors who ran triage coordination, had drifted toward the entrance of row 7. Not close. Just present. The Veth supervisor, whose name I knew was Coordinator Sull, was looking at the amber light on my scanner with an expression I could not read precisely but which made my spine do something uncomfortable. I ignored them and kept my attention on Setha. The fluid should help with the fever, I said. I want to get a second. Medic. Coordinator Sol's voice came from the RAW entrance. What unit are you running? Field scanner, serial G7 series, I said without looking up. Patient presented with undocumented fever and fluid deficit. Running full baseline. That patient is Laborcast unsponsored. Sol's standard was precise, each word placed like a stone. A clinical panel is sufficient. Clinical panel didn't catch the fever for 6 hours, I said. I'm running the full baseline. The silence that followed was the specific silence of someone deciding whether to escalate. I finished checking Setha's fluid line. Her eyes had moved to the RAW entrance, just briefly, one flat look at Sol and the processes gathered there, and then back to her hands in her lap. She had gone very still. Not the stillness of fear. The stillness of someone who had been in this particular moment before and knew how it played. I did not like that she knew how it played. Setha. I kept my voice even. I'm going to step to the supply station for 20 seconds. Don't let anyone touch the scanner. Something moved behind her eyes. All right, she said. I stood up and walked to the supply station at the end of the RAW, directly past Coordinator Sol, and pulled a secondary fluid bag I didn't strictly need. On the way back I stopped beside Sol and said, quietly, when her scan finishes, I'm filing a delayed treatment incident report. 6 hours on a flagged fever is a documentation event regardless of cast notation. I went back to the cot. I heard Sol say something in Caliph to the processors. I didn't catch all of it. I caught let it finish and the human doesn't know what he has. I didn't know what that meant. I sat back down. Setha was looking at me again with those Stillwater eyes. You filed reports before, she said. It wasn't quite a question. Once or twice. Does it do anything? Sometimes, I said. Enough that I keep doing it. The corners of her mouth moved, the smallest possible motion, the kind that on a human face would be the ghost of a smile and on her face was, I think, the same thing. 12 minutes later, the scanner finished. It didn't chime the way it normally did. It produced a sound I had never heard from a G7 unit. 3 short tones, descending, and the amber light turned a steady, deep blue. I picked it up and looked at the result screen. I am a medic. I am not a genealogist, a legal officer, or a Caliph court scholar. But the result on that screen was not subtle. The lineage panel had resolved into a cascade of markers that filled every column, and at the top, in the scanner's own clinical notation, in standard, were 4 words followed by a string of treaty reference numbers. Protected lineage, Vaughn imperial succession. I sat with that for a moment. Then I set the scanner down on the cot, carefully, and looked at Setha Vaughn. She met my eyes. She knew what the scanner had found. She had known before I ran it, and she had sat in row 7 for 6 hours watching resources not allow, and she had not said a word. I thought about what kind of person does that? What kind of weariness or pride or careful survival instinct keeps you silent through 6 hours of a documented fever in a triage annex, and something in my chest pulled tight. I still would have sat down, I said. She looked at me for a long moment. I know, she said, very quietly. That's why I told you my name. I became aware, dimly, that Coordinator Sol had entered the RAW. More than Sol. I heard the sound of the annex going quiet, the low hum of processing desks, the ambient noise of a working transit station, all of it fading as people registered the blue light on the scanner sitting on a cot in row 7. I heard boots. I heard the particular cadence of a senior officer moving through a space that makes room for her, and I looked up to find Station Commander Verith standing at the entrance to the RAW with 2 adjutants and an expression that told me her shift had just become significantly more complicated. She looked at the scanner. She looked at Setha. She crossed the RAW in 4 long strides, picked up the scanner, and read the screen. The room was very quiet. Commander Verith read the result aloud, not loudly, but clearly, the way officers read things when they want witnesses, the lineage markers, the succession notation, the treaty references. 7 treaties. The Calder Reach station was a signatory to 6 of them. The 7th predated the station's construction. She lowered the scanner. The processes at the RAW entrance had gone rigid. Coordinator Sol, to his credit, had not moved. but the grey of his skin had taken on a quality that suggested he was performing very rapid internal calculations. Setha sat on the cot with her fluid line in her arm and her copper amber hair and her still-water eyes, and she looked at none of them. She looked at me. Commander Verith turned to me, and her voice was careful. "Medic, you initiated this scan." "Patient presented with undocumented fever," I said. "Standard of care." Verith looked at me for a moment. Then she turned to the processors at the Rao entrance and said something in Kalith that I caught enough of to understand. It contained the word for violation, and the word for report, and the word for now. Sul moved. The processors moved. The adjutants moved. The annex, which had gone still as a held breath, began the controlled noise of consequence. Boots on decking, the opening of official channels, the sound of a station beginning to account for itself. In the middle of it, Setha Vaughn spoke. She didn't raise her voice. She said, in standard, clearly, to Commander Verith. The medic sat with me. A pause. Before the scan. Verith looked at her. Looked at me. I shrugged. She'd been waiting 6 hours. Setha's gaze came back to me, and what was in it then was not the wariness of a woman who had learned to expect nothing from processing stations, and not the careful stillness of someone performing survival. It was something older and quieter than either. Recognition, maybe. The specific kind that costs something, that only happens when you stop looking for it. I checked her fluid line. Noted the fever reading. Made the documentation entry. How's the side? I asked. Better, she said. Good. I pulled the secondary bag from my kit. I'm going to set a second line. It'll take about 10 minutes. Behind me, the station was still moving. Boots, voices, the cascade of consequence spreading through Calder reached the way water spreads through a cracked hull, and in the middle of all of it, Setha Vaughn sat on a cot in row 7 and let a human medic do his job. The room never quite recovered. I don't think she minded.